There is an hour most people sleep through without ever realizing what they are missing. An hour that feels ordinary to the world, but was never ordinary to us. In a full 24-hour cycle, there was one 60-minute window my organization monitored more closely than any church service, more closely than any conference, more closely than any public revival. It was not loud, it was not flashy, it was not posted on social media. It was 3 a.m. for 14 years. One of my primary responsibilities inside the Brotherhood was simple. Identify believers who were beginning to wake consistently between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning to pray, and stop them before the discipline became permanent. Sunday services did not scare leadership. Large worship gatherings did not scare them. Even packed Easter services did not trigger high-level resource deployment. Those events were predictable. There were emotional spikes. Most people would attend, feel inspired, and return to routine life by Monday afternoon. But a believer who set an alarm for 3 a.m. and kept setting it, that was different. That was a threat. My name is Lance. I'm 46 years old. I followed Jesus Christ for 15 years. Before that, I spent 14 years inside an organized Satanist brotherhood that ran systematic operations against committed Christians. I was not on the fringe. I was not a bystander. I ran assignments. I trained others. I analyzed outcomes. And the most heavily resourced category of Christian target we tracked was what we classified as Level 1 pre-dawn intercessors. Inside the organization, every believer was categorized. Nothing was random. Nothing was emotional. Everything was strategic. Level 4 was what leadership called sleepers, cultural Christians. Church attendance without depth. Prayer limited to emergencies. Minimal resistance required. In truth, they often neutralized themselves through spiritual passivity. Level 3 was the active congregation. Engaged believers, small groups, consistent church involvement, regular prayer. These required moderate pressure, financial strain, relational tension, distractions. Not to destroy them, but to keep them occupied. Busy believers are manageable believers. Level 2 were intercessors, people praying beyond themselves, for cities, leaders, nations. These required sustained campaigns. Attrition tactics. The goal was exhaustion. But Level 1 was different. Level 1 was not defined by volume of prayer, but by timing and consistency. Specifically, believers who developed disciplined, repeated prayer between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m. Those believers triggered escalation. The first reason was what leadership called the silence factor. Most of the day is saturated with human activity, noise, movement, emotional interference. That noise provides cover. Distraction is easy when the world is loud. But at 3 a.m., most neighborhoods are still. Most homes are dark. Traffic is minimal. Digital chatter slows. The atmosphere shifts. And in that silence, focused prayer carries differently. We observed something operationally consistent. The same believer praying at noon required standard countermeasures. The same believer praying at 3 a.m. required triple the resources to disrupt. Same person, same prayer, different hour. The data repeated across regions. Silence amplifies intention. The second reason was commitment evidence. Our leadership was not afraid of convenient faith. Comfortable faith is predictable. Sporadic prayer is manageable. But waking up at 3 a.m. costs something. It costs comfort. It costs sleep. It costs routine. And sacrifice signals depth. Leadership used to say, find out who is willing to lose sleep for their God. That is, the one you stop early. Because once a believer proves they will sacrifice comfort consistently, surface-level distractions lose power. You cannot easily intimidate someone who has already chosen discomfort voluntarily. The third reason was what we called the accumulation principle. One night of 3 a.m. prayer was noteworthy. 7 consecutive nights was concerning. 14 nights began to shift outcomes. 30 nights changed environments. We tracked this carefully. Believers operating under manageable pressure would begin a 3-0-day pre-dawn commitment. During week 1, our usual tactics worked: fatigue, distraction, doubt, emotional heaviness. But somewhere between days 10 and 14, results began to change. Financial blockages loosened. Long-standing conflicts softened. Opportunities opened unexpectedly. Assignments that had been stable for months began losing effectiveness. We called it corridor formation. I cannot explain the mechanics in technical language, but the pattern was undeniable. Sustained pre-dawn prayer appeared to create cumulative spiritual momentum that weakened previously effective interference. And when that happened, escalation was required. Now let me tell you about the 5 primary weapons we deployed against 3 a.m. believers. Weapon 1, sleep suppression. Not simple tiredness, targeted exhaustion. Restless nights, unexplained wake-ups at 1 a.m. so that 3 o'clock felt unbearable. Sudden insomnia cycles. The goal was to make discipline unsustainable. Weapon 2, distraction surge. If a believer woke up successfully, intrusive thoughts increased. Random anxieties. To-do lists flooding the mind. Emotional static. Anything to fragment focus. Weapon 3, emotional numbness. This one was subtle. The believer would pray but feel nothing. No presence, no response, no emotional reinforcement. The goal was discouragement. Why am I doing this? Nothing is happening. Weapon 4, schedule overload. Increased daytime pressure, unexpected responsibilities, family strain, work complications. The aim was simple: make pre-dawn prayer feel irresponsible or impractical. Weapon 5, doubt amplification. Whispers like, "This is extreme. You're being legalistic. God doesn't need you to wake up this early." The goal was to reframe discipline as unnecessary. These 5 tactics formed our first-tier response. And here is the part that matters most. They failed against believers who persisted. Not instantly, not easily, but consistently. Because once a believer pushed through the first 2 weeks, once discipline became identity instead of experiment, something shifted permanently. Fatigue lost leverage. Distraction weakened. Doubt quieted. We watched it happen over and over. There was a construction worker in Arkansas who began 3 a.m. prayer during a financial crisis. Week 1, heavy interference. Week 2, escalation. By week 3, contracts began opening that had been stalled for months. There was a single mother in Ohio who committed to 21 days at 3 a.m. during a custody battle. Emotional suppression failed. Legal momentum shifted unexpectedly in her favor. Case after case, and leadership hated patterns they could not control. By year 10 of my involvement, internal briefings acknowledged something openly. Sustained pre-dawn prayer could not be permanently neutralized. It could only be delayed if the believer quit. Everything depended on quitting. That was the hinge. If they continued past resistance, outcomes changed. I want to say something clearly. This was never about superstition or theatrics. It was about discipline, consistency, and sacrifice, aligning in a quiet hour where distractions are minimized. At 3 a.m., there are no notifications, no applause, no audience. Just you and God. And that simplicity makes the hour powerful. When I eventually left the organization and began following Christ, one of the first disciplines I reclaimed was the very one I had spent years trying to shut down. 3 a.m., not every night, not out of fear, not out of ritual, but out of understanding. Because I had seen from the other side what consistent sacrifice does. If you're attempting to build a 3 a.m. prayer habit and encountering unusual resistance, heaviness, doubt, exhaustion that feels disproportionate, understand something. Further resistance often confirms value. The hour is not magic. The power is not in the clock. The power is in what the hour represents, costly consistency in hidden places. And hidden consistency changes visible outcomes. For 14 years, I worked to prevent that habit from taking root in believers. For 15 years now, I have watched it produce breakthrough in ways I once tried to stop. The organization feared that hour because it revealed seriousness, and seriousness, sustained long enough, transforms people. If you choose to step into that window, understand this. The first week may feel difficult. The second week may test you. But persistence compounds, and once momentum builds, The same forces that tried to stop you lose leverage. I know. I helped design the leverage, and I watched it fail. Pull first tier. That was the phrase we used when a situation had moved beyond routine management and into costly escalation. You need to understand something about first-tier assignments. They were not unlimited. Contrary to what many people imagine, the organization I served in operated within what I can only describe now as a resource economy. There were rankings, allocations, territories, and limits. First tier was expensive to deploy and expensive to maintain. It required authorization, oversight, and justification. It was never the starting point. It was the last lever you pulled when lower strategies failed. When a target developed a consistent 3 a.m. prayer habit and pushed through resistance long enough to hit what we internally marked as a 1-4 day threshold, the file was flagged for possible escalation. That 1-4 day mark mattered. It represented consistency under pressure. It meant early disruption tactics had failed. And when that happened, moving a target from Tier 3 to Tier 1 pulled from a finite pool assigned to our region. If 3, 4, or more believers in the same geographic area crossed that threshold around the same time, which I saw happen more than once, it stretched local operations thin. We were forced into prioritization meetings that should never have been necessary, deciding which praying grandmother, which young father, which college student warranted first-tier allocation was not something leadership liked having to do. It exposed limits. That is why early interdiction was always the standing directive. Stop the 3 a.m. prayer in the first 7 to 10 days. Break it before it stabilizes. Interrupt it before the corridor forms. Because once consistency built momentum, escalation became more likely, and escalation cost us. The strategy was simple in theory. If you can make the alarm feel unbearable, if you can make the prayer feel empty, if you can nudge the believer toward the conclusion that they are not wired for this kind of discipline, they will de-escalate themselves. No confrontation required. No major deployment necessary. They will decide it is not sustainable and quietly return to comfortable spirituality. That outcome preserved resources. But if you miss that window, if they push through the early fog and make it past 2 weeks, you are fighting uphill for the remainder of the campaign, and I cannot overstate how often we were fighting uphill. Let me walk you through the first weapon we consistently used against emerging 3 a.m. prayer habits. Internally we called it the sleep seal. It was always the opening move. Before distraction, before discouragement, before relational agitation, the sleep seal went in first because it targeted the entry point. If you cannot get the believer out of bed, you never have to deal with what happens when they are on their knees. It was the most efficient interception point in the sequence. Sleep seal did not simply mean tiredness. Everyone gets tired. This was layered. It operated in 2 distinct phases. The first layer focused on the 2:30 to 2:50 a.m. window, the half hour before most alarms were set to sound. The assignment's goal was to deepen the sleep cycle precisely when the body would naturally begin transitioning toward lighter sleep. Normally, as morning approaches, your body starts to prepare for waking. The sleep seal reversed that trajectory. It pressed the target into heavier sleep instead of allowing the rise toward wakefulness. The threshold of consciousness felt like a war. If you have ever reached over to silence your alarm and later had no memory of doing so, that sensation was exactly what we aimed for. The hand moves. The phone is quiet. You are technically awake for 3 seconds, but awareness never fully surfaces. An hour later you wake confused, wondering how you missed it again. If the first layer failed and the target actually woke up, the second layer activated. We called it spiritual gravity. It manifested as heaviness in the limbs, weight in the chest, pressure on the eyelids. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just dense. As if you were wading through water. Standing felt harder than it should. Kneeling felt like lifting something disproportionate to your own body. The mind was foggy, not chaotic, just dulled. Exhaustion that did not match the hours slept, and interestingly, it peaked specifically during the 3 a.m. attempt. By mid-morning the person could feel relatively normal. I remember one target clearly. A retired school teacher in her mid-50s. Lived alone. Faithful member of a local church, she attended a prayer conference and returned home determined to begin a 3 a.m. routine. Her file landed on my desk. Days 1 through 3, she slept through the alarm entirely. No recollection. Day 4, she woke, but could not move. Lay there 20 minutes, rationalizing. Day 5, she made it to her knees and fell asleep on the floor within minutes. I reported steady containment. Day 6, she made it again, and I sensed we were close to her quitting. Day 7, she pushed through and stayed on her knees for over an hour. I cannot fully explain what shifted in that house, but something did. The atmosphere changed in a way that required escalation review. I reported that the sleep seal was no longer reliable. Leadership did not like that report. Here is what I learned later from observing countermeasures. Willpower alone rarely broke the sleep seal. Grit helped, but grit without structure often failed. What consistently disrupted it was pre-commitment, physical preparation the night before, multiple staggered alarms instead of one, placing the device across the room so standing became unavoidable, laying out a Bible open to a specific passage, writing a prayer list ahead of time, creating a visible, tangible destination for the body to move toward. Accountability also mattered. When a believer told someone else their plan, the assignment had to contend not only with private resolve, but relational expectation. And there was one more element I saw repeatedly. The moment consciousness returned, before checking the phone, or negotiating with the bed, some believers spoke the name of Jesus out loud, one word, audible, immediate. I saw that single act cut through the heaviness faster than anything else attached to the sleep seal. At the time I did not understand why, now I do. When sleep seal failed, and a believer consistently reached their prayer spot, we deployed the second assignment, the distraction flood. If the body is upright, you shift focus to the mind. Because being on your knees does not automatically mean you're engaging with clarity or authority. Posture is not the same as focus. The distraction flood had 3 layers. First came urgent practical thoughts, not evil, not obscene, mundane but pressing. Bills, emails, conversations, appointments, responsibilities. They arrived with artificial urgency at 3 a.m., creating the illusion that this was the ideal time to problem solve. Once the mind locked into planning mode, intercession weakened. If that did not fully redirect attention, the second layer introduced mental scatter, fragments of memory, incomplete sentences, random images, snippets of songs, pieces of yesterday's conversation. Nothing cohesive enough to confront, just constant low-grade static. Sustained focus became exhausting. After 15 minutes, many concluded they were simply too distracted to pray effectively. The third layer, the most potent, was relational agitation. Specific faces would surface accompanied by unresolved emotion, a slight, a tension, a misunderstanding, not to bring healing but to stir unease. Silence felt tense instead of peaceful. Stillness felt heavy instead of restorative. The brilliance of the distraction flood was its subtlety. A believer could spend 45 minutes technically in prayer and walk away feeling nothing happened. That sense of futility was the real objective, not dramatic defeat, but erosion. What broke it? Anchored prayer, structure before spontaneity. Those who opened by speaking scripture aloud, even softly, stabilized their minds more effectively than those who began in silence. Hearing their own voice engage sacred text created a focal point. The flood struggled to override. Written prayer lists, prepared beforehand, provided direction before scatter set in. The mind had somewhere to land. But the countermeasure that frustrated leadership most was worship before intercession. 5 to 10 minutes of singing or softly speaking a familiar chorus shifted the atmosphere in a way analytical reports could not fully quantify. It reordered attention, it aligned emotion before petition, and it consistently weakened the distraction flood's grip. There were additional assignments beyond these, layered progressively depending on response. Some targeted discouragement through comparison, subtly suggesting others were more disciplined or more anointed. Some targeted physical schedules, increasing daytime fatigue through ordinary circumstances. Others amplified minor conflicts to drain emotional energy. None were as efficient as early disruption, and all were less effective when believers combined preparation, spoken truth, accountability, and worship. If you take anything from this, understand the pattern. The resistance often intensifies at the beginning, because that is when habits are most fragile. The first week matters. The second week matters even more. Consistency shifts, leverage. Structure protects momentum. Spoken truth stabilizes thought. Worship realigns focus. We operated assuming most people would quit before day 10. Many did. Some did not. And the ones who did not forced us into decisions that revealed we were not as limitless as we projected. I am telling you this not to glorify what I participated in, but to expose mechanics. When you recognize a pattern, you are less likely to misinterpret it. Tiredness at 2:45 a.m. is not always a moral failure. Scattered thoughts at 3:07 a.m. are not always proof you are incapable of prayer. Sometimes resistance is simply resistance. What I once called assignments, I now see as predictable pressure points. Prepare for them. Anticipate them. Counter them. Anticipate them. Counter them intentionally. And understand this above all, early persistence carries disproportionate weight. The first 7 to 14 days of any disciplined spiritual practice are often the most contested because they determine whether escalation is necessary at all. From the inside, I watched believers who quietly refused to quit alter the trajectory of their own environments. Not overnight, not theatrically, but steadily. And steady pressure, applied consistently at the same hour, was far more disruptive to our operations than emotional intensity that burned bright for 3 days and disappeared on the 4th. Consistency was the variable we feared most. Not performed, not produced, just offered with intention. That was the distinction that mattered. When a believer began the 3 a.m. hour with 5 to 10 minutes of genuine, focused worship before asking for a single thing, the atmosphere shifted in a measurable way. I am not exaggerating when I say that the distraction flood lost 60 to 70% of its effectiveness in that same session almost immediately. I documented it carefully the first time it happened across multiple targets. My higher-ups questioned my methodology. They assumed I had misread the variables or underestimated the other factors at play. The second time I presented similar findings, they asked me to re-examine the data. By the third round of consistent results over several months, the resistance stopped. They did not argue with the numbers anymore. They simply told me to find another approach. Worship is not faff. Worship is not faff. It is not a warm-up act before the real prayer begins. It is not emotional decoration. It is alignment. When a believer enters the 3 a.m. hour and spends 5 to 10 minutes magnifying God for who He is, rather than presenting requests, something stabilizes internally. Focus sharpens. Emotional agitation lowers. Mental scatter decreases. The distraction flood depends on a mind that has not yet settled. Worship settles it. The flood depends on urgency about personal needs. Worship recenters attention on God's character rather than personal lack. When that reorientation happens first, petition and intercession flow from steadiness rather than anxiety. That steadiness was difficult for our assignments to penetrate. Use worship first, before you bring a single name, before you present a single crisis, before you analyze a single problem. 5 to 10 minutes of sincere adoration, even if it is one simple chorus whispered in the dark. It changes the environment in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. If sleep seal failed and distraction flood lost traction, the third assignment came into play. Internally, we called it the empty field. This one is subtle because it does not feel like resistance. It feels like you. It feels like inadequacy. It feels like you are the problem. And that is precisely why it works. When a believer pushed through exhaustion and mental interference and arrived at prayer genuinely focused, sincerely engaged, lips moving with intention, the empty field was designed to make that encounter feel hollow. Not dramatic opposition, not torment, just absence. Like speaking into a wide-open field and hearing no echo return. Like knocking on a door and hearing nothing on the other side. Silence that feels personal. I need to clarify something important. The empty field did not block prayer from reaching God. It did not encounter an actual barrier. It targeted perception, not reality. The objective was to suppress the subjective experience of connection, the warmth, the sense of nearness, the subtle internal assurance that someone is listening. Leadership understood this distinction clearly. They would say, "We cannot stop the prayer from landing. We can only influence how the believer feels about whether it landed." If you can make someone feel consistently unheard, consistently distant from God, you do not have to sever the connection. They will begin to question it themselves. This assignment was effective, especially against newer believers or those who equated spiritual maturity with constant emotional reinforcement. When someone rises at 3 a.m. for 2 weeks, pushing through fatigue and distraction, and still feels nothing, vulnerability sets in. Not because God is absent, but because the emotional confirmation they expected is absent. That gap between truth and feeling is where the empty field operated. I remember running this against a young pastor in his mid-30s who had planted a church and committed to building his ministry on disciplined early prayer. For 3 weeks, the empty field ran at full capacity. He showed up faithfully. He knelt. He prayed. And afterward, he told his wife he felt like he was speaking into a wall. He questioned whether something was blocking him. Around day 20, he nearly stopped. He did not stop. Around day 25 to 30, something shifted in him. Not emotionally at first, structurally. He continued showing up whether it felt fruitful or not. He stopped evaluating prayer based on sensation. And that is when our leverage decreased sharply. The believers who pushed through the empty field long enough developed what leadership begrudgingly referred to as dry season armor. Faith, detached from emotional dependency. Commitment rooted below feeling. A believer whose devotion rises and falls with emotional reinforcement can be managed. Introduce highs occasionally. Interbose them strategically. Let lows erode consistency. That cycle can continue for years. But a believer who prays whether they feel God or not, who shows up because of conviction rather than sensation, becomes difficult to destabilize. You cannot exploit an emotional pressure point that no longer governs behavior. The countermeasure to the empty field is not manufacturing emotion. It is not increasing volume or length in an attempt to force a breakthrough feeling. That approach reinforces the lie that the goal of prayer is sensation. The countermeasure is verbalized faith, speaking aloud in the quiet. I do not feel your presence right now, but I know you are here. I am here because you are worthy. Not because this feels powerful. That declaration removes the assignment's leverage. The empty field can mute emotion. It cannot mute a will anchored in truth. If someone has been praying and feeling silence, it does not mean the prayer is ineffective. It may mean depth is forming. Emotional dryness does not equal spiritual abandonment. It often precedes durability. When the empty field failed to halt consistency, Assignment 4 activated the doubt injection. This operated deeper than feeling. The empty field targeted experience. The doubt injection targeted belief. It did not attempt to make prayer feel ineffective. It questioned whether prayer was effective at all. The introduction was subtle. Not loud skepticism, not overt cynicism, just small, reasonable questions. If this discipline matters so much, why are visible results minimal? Are you sure this is not ritual disguised as spirituality? Are you certain the sacrifice is necessary when others seem fine without it? These thoughts sounded rational because they were framed as inquiry rather than accusation. The doubt injection was most effective in isolation. When a believer kept their 3 a.m. practice entirely private, without accountability or shared testimony, the questioning voice had less opposition. It sounded like their own reasoning, and because it felt internal, it was harder to identify as external pressure. Community disrupted this pattern, not through debates or arguments, but through shared conviction. When at least one other person knew about the discipline, affirmed it, or practiced something similar, the narrative that it was unnecessary lost weight. Testimony also mattered. Written records of answered prayers created tangible evidence that countered abstract doubt. A prayer journal became more than reflection. It became documentation. When someone could look back and see specific requests and subsequent outcomes, skeptici, more lost momentum. Doubt thrives where memory is short and community is absent. It weakens where testimony is preserved and shared. The fifth assignment was the longest and most cumulative. We called it the physical wear campaign. Unlike the previous strategies that targeted individual sessions, this one targeted sustainability. It operated across weeks and months. The goal was simple: make the 3 a.m. discipline physically unsustainable over time. Rising at that hour creates sleep debt. The physical wear campaign ensured the debt compounded. Minor disruptions during early nighttime sleep, difficulty falling back asleep after prayer, unexpected daytime demands increasing fatigue, none dramatic alone, but collectively draining. Fatigue during work hours, irritability in family interactions, reduced clarity when decisions needed to be made. The aim was not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. Emotional wear accompanied physical strain. When someone is consistently tired, their resilience decreases. Small frustrations feel larger. Motivation dips. The question subtly forms, is this worth it? If the earlier assignments did not break consistency, accumulated exhaustion might. What countered the physical wear campaign was wisdom. Adjusting sleep schedules intentionally rather than simply sacrificing rest. Napping strategically when possible. Guarding evening hours more carefully. Refusing to romanticize burnout as spirituality. Sustainable discipline outlasts dramatic intensity. Believers who treated 3 a.m. prayer not as a test of toughness, but as a structured commitment adapted. They went to bed earlier. They managed energy proactively. They listened to their bodies without surrendering conviction. They understood that endurance is not built by ignoring limits, but by respecting them wisely. Across all 5 assignments, one theme emerged repeatedly. Consistent, altered leverage. Early disruption mattered because habits are fragile at the beginning. Once stabilized, they gained inertia. Worship stabilized focus. Faith declarations neutralized emotional emptiness. Community and testimony dismantled doubt. Practical wisdom protected endurance. From the inside, what unsettled leadership most was not dramatic spiritual experiences. It was steady believers who quietly refused to stop. Those who worshipped before asking. Those who prayed by faith when feeling was absent. Those who documented results and shared them. Those who adjusted their schedules to sustain the practice rather than burn out. Resistance is often most concentrated at the start, because the start determines trajectory. If you understand the pattern, you are less likely to misinterpret pressure as failure. Tiredness is not always weakness. Silence is not always absence. Questions are not always disbelief. Fatigue is not always defeat. Sometimes resistance is simply evidence that something significant is forming. 5 to 10 minutes of worship can reorder an hour. A spoken declaration can steady a dry season. A shared testimony can quiet an intrusive doubt. A wise sleep adjustment can extend endurance. From where I once stood, the most formidable believers were not the loudest or the most emotionally expressive. They were the most consistent. They prayed whether it felt powerful or ordinary. They worshipped whether they were energized or tired. They documented, shared, adjusted, and continued. Consistency anchored in conviction, rather than sensation, was the variable that disrupted everything. Over time, the accumulated tiredness begins to feel unsustainable. What starts as a valued spiritual discipline slowly starts to seem optional, a practice that can be paused and resumed later when life is less demanding. The effect is gradual. Fatigue builds day by day. Fatigue builds day by day. And the believer begins to question whether the effort is realistic, whether it is reasonable to keep getting up in the dark to pray when their body is screaming for rest. But the wear is not only physical, the emotional component is subtle, relational rather than confrontational. A dramatic argument with a spouse or friend tends to provoke urgency, often energizing prayer rather than diminishing it. The strategy here is quiet, consistent relational pressure, the kind that slowly erodes the emotional reserves that sustain a long-term discipline without ever appearing hostile. A spouse is not openly antagonistic, but is quietly unavailable, engaged in their own routine, indifferent in ways that seem small but accumulate. Household tension never escalates into crises But misunderstandings linger, frustrations go unresolved, and the comfort and emotional rest that usually support spiritual discipline slowly erode. These small pressures are enough, over weeks and months, to make the discipline seem burdensome, to make the mind and body consider postponement. Alongside relational pressure, there is a phenomenon I call community drift. Anyone who consistently rises at 3 a.m. begins to operate on a different rhythm than those around them. Sleep patterns differ. Mornings are prioritized differently. Energy at certain hours diverges from social norms. Invitations to social gatherings might be declined. Subtle differences emerge in family engagement, work interactions, and social availability. Over time, these differences create distance. Not outright rejection, not hostility, just a quiet sense of separation. The believer begins to feel isolated, subtly, from their community. This isolation amplifies the effects of doubt and emotional wear. A person who feels alone in their discipline is more vulnerable to the intellectual questioning that I have described earlier, and that is said, emptiness of spiritual perception feels heavier when no one around them shares the experience. Over time, the combination of physical fatigue, relational subtlety, and social isolation accumulates, and the discipline begins to feel like a burden too heavy to bear. The countermeasure to this slow erosion is not merely better sleep hygiene or smarter scheduling. The countermeasure is foundational. It is covenant language. Those who sustain a 3 a.m. prayer discipline over months and years, not just weeks, do so because they have explicitly, intentionally, and decisively named their practice a covenant with God. This is not a casual commitment, not a goal to achieve, not a discipline to set aside when inconvenient. It is a promise. It is a vow that persists beyond immediate comfort, beyond visibility of results, beyond relational friction, beyond fatigue and exhaustion. By framing the practice as a covenant, the believer shifts the nature of the decision every morning. A discipline can be postponed. A goal can be deferred. A habit can be skipped. A covenant, however, is categorical. It is anchored in identity and intention, creating a resilience that physical wear, relational subtlety, and social drift cannot undermine. Those who could say, "I made a promise, I am not breaking it tonight," became impervious to prolonged campaigns designed to disrupt consistency. Operationally, the campaigns eventually ran out of leverage because the believer's commitment was no longer negotiable. I remember the moment it became undeniable for me, the point at which the evidence of sustained, powerful prayer crystallized in a way that could no longer be rationalized as circumstantial. I was 31, 14 years deep in operational work, a senior-level field operative, overseeing campaigns, training newcomers, reporting to higher-ups. Doubt was foreign to me. I had seen the ignorance I administered produce predictable outcomes. What I began to question, however, was not the reality of the work, but whether it could be overcome when applied to the right person. There was a woman, early 40s, residing 30 miles from my area, a committed intercessor since her late 20s. She had maintained a consistent 3 a.m. prayer discipline for over 2 years, without exception. She was what the organization called a corridor veteran. The principle I had been taught, the 1-4-day corridor accumulation, did not begin to describe her. She had built a long-standing corridor, sustained over 2 years, and her life, family, and community bore the visible fruit of that devotion. Outcomes we could not contain were manifest. Situations resolved, lives transformed, doors opened that had been closed to our interference. From an operational perspective, her prayers produced tangible results. My higher-ups escalated her to me personally, meaning all standard resources had been exhausted, and they were now committing first-tier attention. I was tasked with closing the account. I ran the full sequence against her: sleep-sealed, distraction flood, empty field, doubt injection, physical wear campaign. I pushed the doubt injection harder than ever before, introducing intellectual challenges, theological questions, historical critiques, anything that could sow rational uncertainty. Physical wear was applied meticulously. I ensured fatigue, relational subtlety, and accumulated strain reached levels that would have broken most believers. Yet she persisted. Day after day she rose at 3, knelt, prayed, and interceded, not primarily for herself, not for her family, but for others she barely knew. She brought names before God, cried in earnest, remained utterly alone in a dark room, committing herself entirely to others. It was during one of these sessions that I experienced what I now understand as clarity. Observing her alone in that moment, seeing her devotion, I realized with absolute certainty that what I had been working against was real and good. It was true, authentic, spiritually alive, and I was not on the right side of it. There was no dramatic confrontation, no vision, no voice from heaven. It was the accumulation of reality, made manifest, the undeniable truth of a life consistently dedicated to prayer, producing measurable fruit beyond manipulation or interruption. That moment marked the beginning of the end for me. I did not leave immediately. Practical realities delayed departure, and there were real costs to disengaging from an organization of that nature. But within 6 months, I formally reported that her account had achieved spiritual consolidation beyond operational interference. That continued resources would yield diminishing returns. Operationally, the language was clinical. Personally, it was acknowledgement that she had surpassed anything we could challenge. She was stronger than the assignments, and I could no longer engage in their disruption in good conscience. 8 months later, I found myself in a small, almost empty Wednesday night prayer meeting in a church I had never attended, in a town I did not live in. I entered with no plan, simply sitting at the back. When invited to bring anything before God, I began to speak, for about 45 minutes, unrestrained, unguarded. I do not recall every word, but I remember the release, the sensation of laying down 14 years of burden, the recognition that the weight I had carried was no longer mine to bear. I had begun a new chapter, one marked by lightness and clarity, a cross with His name on it, rather than the weight of operational deception. The lessons I convey from that period are absolute and enduring. I have walked through 5 primary assignments deployed against 3 a.m. prayer: the sleep seal, the distraction flood, the empty field, the doubt injection, and the physical wear campaign. I have seen them applied repeatedly, monitored their effects, and documented their failures. Not theoretical failures, not isolated exceptions, but consistent inability to overcome committed, persistent, faith-driven believers. Each assignment has a weakness. The sleep seal is countered by pre-committed faith. The distraction flood is neutralized when worship precedes petition. The empty field is breached when prayer operates by faith, rather than feeling. The doubt injection is defeated through community and testimony. The physical wear campaign fails when prayer is framed as a covenant rather than a routine or habit. I have observed every one of these assignments fail repeatedly over 14 years. The enemy is not all-powerful. He is not omniscient. Resources are finite, and his capacity is limited against believers with access to the God of the universe. When believers understand this, not as doctrine but as lived practice, the balance of power is unmistakable. The choice to rise, to show up faithfully, to endure the first weeks of discipline, is decisive. 14 days, 1 hour each morning, building the corridor, establishing routine and momentum, is sufficient to begin experiencing the tangible reality of what is possible. I challenge you to engage this practice with commitment. Set the alarm, rise, push through fatigue, distraction, emptiness, doubt, and relational strain. Build your corridor not as a test, not as a ritual, but as a covenant, a declaration of intent, a consistent choice to show up regardless of circumstance. Witness what is waiting beyond the first 2 weeks. Observe the results of sustained, deliberate practice. Now, I invite you to join me in prayer. Kneel if possible wherever you are, and pray with intention. Father God, I come before you tonight, knowing the opposition set against the 3 a.m. prayer. I ask you to break every assignment, targeting my diligence, focus, and faith. Remove the sleep seal, restore physical responsiveness, and ease the threshold of waking. Quiet the distraction flood, still mental chaos, and order my thoughts according to your spirit. Break the empty field, that I may experience the reality of your presence. Nullify the doubt injection, a firm conviction through community and testimony. Restore strength against the physical wear campaign, renewing body, mind, and relational support. Equip those who have never attempted this hour to begin with courage. I thank you that no weapon is invincible and that every assignment has a weakness found in you alone. In the name of Jesus Christ, Amen. Faith, consistency, covenant commitment, intentional worship, community, and documentation of outcomes. These are the pillars upon which resilience against every assignment rests. I have seen them fail against nothing more than determination aligned with divine reality. I have witnessed the power of a believer who refuses to stop, and that power remains accessible to anyone willing to rise consistently over the first 14 days and beyond, building a corridor that no assignment can permanently disrupt.